All right, let's jump right in. We're going to talk about one single, absolutely chaotic year that basically set the entire continent of Europe on fire. A year when the old way of doing things, the old monarchies, were shaken right to their core. This is the story of 1848, what they call the Springtime of Nations. It was a series of events that, in just a few short months, changed pretty much everything.
And, when I say it changed the whole continent, I am not kidding. Just look at this number. We're not talking about one or two little protests here and there. Nope. We are talking about more than 50 countries, 50, all swept up in this massive tidal wave of revolution. The scale of it is it's mind-boggling, really. So, what exactly was going on? Well, the key thing to get is that this wasn't some big, coordinated plan. It was more like a chain reaction. Think of it as a series of dominoes falling, one after the other. Each uprising was a little different, for sure, but they all shared this common DNA, a set of ideas that just set the continent ablaze.
And if you boil it all down, these revolutions were really about three big things. First, you had people demanding liberal reforms, things like constitutions, basic civil rights, a real say in how they're governed. Second, this powerful idea of national independence. You had all these different ethnic groups stuck inside giant empires, and they were saying, hey, we want to rule ourselves. And third, just basic economic justice. People were poor, they were hungry, and they were demanding a better life. These were the ideas echoing from Paris to Budapest.
So you have to ask, why then? Why 1848? What made Europe so ready to just explode? Well, a great way to think about it is that the whole continent was like a giant tinderbox, just packed with dry fuel, waiting for a single spark. So let's unpack the four big pressures that filled that tinderbox. First up, and this one is huge, was just pure economic misery. The 1840s were a rough decade. You had terrible harvests, which led to massive food shortages. I mean, people were literally starving. At the exact same time, the new factories of the Industrial Revolution were creating terrible working conditions and high unemployment in the cities. And this wasn't just hitting the poor. The middle class was feeling the pain too, and everybody was demanding change. On top of all that economic pain, you had governments cracking down hard. See, after Napoleon was defeated back in 1815, these old-school conservative monarchies were put back in charge. And guys like Prince Metternich in Austria were masters of repression. We're talking censorship, secret police, the whole shebang. People had no real rights to speak of, and that frustration with being told what to do and what to think was just boiling over. Now, here's where a brand new, powerful idea enters the picture: nationalism. For the first time, people started to really identify with their shared language, their culture, their people. So Germans started dreaming of a unified Germany. Italians wanted a unified Italy. This was a direct threat to the old empires, especially the Austrian Empire, which was this patchwork of a dozen different ethnic groups all suddenly demanding their own countries. And the final ingredient in our tinderbox was the ideological fuel itself: liberalism. The ideas from that first French Revolution back in 1789, liberty, equality, all that, they never really went away. The growing middle class, in particular, was totally fed up with absolute monarchs. They wanted parliaments, they wanted constitutions, they wanted civil liberties. Essentially, they wanted a government that ruled by the consent of the people, not because some king said God put him there. So you've got the perfect storm, right? Economic misery, political repression, nationalism, liberalism. The tinderbox is full. All it needs is a spark. And that spark, as it so often did in European history, was lit in Paris. It's really wild to think about. Just one series of protests in one city, and it would unleash this political wildfire that absolutely nobody saw coming and nobody could control. And in February of 1848, it happened fast. I mean, blindingly fast. Protests in Paris just exploded. King Louis Philippe took one look around and abdicated. And just like that, boom, France declared its Second Republic. But that unity didn't last long. By June, the middle-class liberals and the more radical workers were literally fighting each other in the streets. It was a bloody mess. And a few years later, the Republic was totally gone, replaced by another emperor, Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon, a classic revolutionary roller coaster. The news from Paris spread like wildfire. The new telegraphs were humming with the message, "The king is out, France is a republic." And that's all it took. Within weeks, that fire had jumped to the borders, and uprisings were erupting almost at the same time across the German states, deep in the Austrian Empire, and all over Italy. Over in the German lands, liberals and nationalists thought this was their moment. Revolts popped up everywhere, and for the very first time, an all-German parliament gathered in Frankfurt to write a constitution for a new, unified, liberal Germany. I mean, the hope in the air must have been incredible. They even offered the crown of this new nation to the King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, and he said no.
And his reason why tells you everything you need to know about the old way of thinking. He sneered that he would not accept a crown from the gutter, meaning a crown offered to him by the common people, by shopkeepers and lawyers in a parliament. His aristocratic pride just couldn't handle it. And that single refusal basically doomed the entire movement. Without Prussia's army, the dream was over, crushed by the old conservative forces.
So if things were messy in Germany, they were an absolute catastrophe for the Austrian Empire. It felt like the whole thing was being ripped apart at the seams all at once. In the capital, Vienna, students and workers took to the streets and forced the ultimate symbol of the old order, Metternich, to actually flee for his life. At the exact same time, the Hungarians, led by the amazing Lajos Kossuth, declared independence. Then the Czechs in Prague rose up. Then the Italians under Austrian rule revolted. The empire was literally on the verge of disappearing.
So for a few incredible months, it really looked like the revolutionaries had won. It looked like a whole new Europe was being born. But the old order, the kings, the nobles, the professional armies, they weren't gone. They were just catching their breath, regrouping. And when they finally struck back, they struck back with a vengeance.
And so by 1849, the springtime was over. One after another, the revolutions were brutally crushed by armies. The monarchs came back and retook their thrones. The revolutionary leaders were either executed, thrown in jail, or they had to flee the continent. All those incredible hopes for immediate drastic change, they were completely dashed. Looking at it then, it seemed like a total unmitigated failure. But this is where the story gets really interesting, because this is the great paradox of 1848. If you were standing there in 1850, you would have called it a disaster, a complete flop. But history, it has a much longer view. The revolutionary flames were definitely put out, yes, but the embers that were left behind, they kept smoldering. And those ideas that were unleashed in that one year, they couldn't be put back in the box. They would go on to fundamentally reshape the continent. So you really have to hold both verdicts in your head at the same time. On one side, yes, total short-term failure. Kings were back, constitutions were torn up. But on the other side, a massive long-term victory. Think about it. Ancient systems like feudalism and serfdom were abolished for good in places like the Austrian Empire. That's a huge social revolution that freed millions of people. That genie of nationalism, it was out of the bottle, and it became the most powerful political force for the next century. And in a beautiful historical irony, those dreams of a unified Italy and Germany that failed so badly in 1848, they would actually happen just 20 years later directly because of the seeds planted here.
So, what's the big takeaway here? Well, 1848 was the first truly pan-European revolution. It was this massive, defining clash between the old world of kings and the new world of liberal ideas. And maybe the most important thing is that even in failing, it proved that ordinary people could rise up and shake the most powerful thrones on Earth. It was, in the end, probably the most successful failure in modern history, an earthquake that completely changed the political landscape forever. And all of this brings us to one last, really important question. If it was all crushed so brutally, if the winter of reaction came so quickly, why on earth do we still call it the springtime of nations? That's a name that's full of hope. Well, maybe it's because, just like in the spring, not every seed you plant sprouts right away. Some of them lie dormant in the ground, just waiting for the right season to finally grow.